It's no secret that white's considered one of the weaker colors in Commander. I mean, who am I kidding? It's the weakest, right?
So I think Ally of Zendikar was the last generically good, generically powerful, generically borderline oppressive, I guess, card out of white. Because every other card that warps a format right now is red, or black, or green. Definitely green.
Mono white, it's just not there. Yeah. Green is king. Mm-hmm. The other colors do pretty well, but white is just it's lacking.
White is my favorite color in Magic, and I feel like for some reason Wizards of the Coast won't throw it a fucking bone.
And the monkey's paw curls.
I have many words to say about this latest incarnation of the White Praetor. As soon as I saw the card, I sent off an email saying, please never print this card. We of course then talked about it together as well and reiterated our point during the joint feedback, this is not a healthy card for Commander. I'm firmly in the camp that the card is a net negative for the format.
Are you recording on your end, Parker? Are you ready to go?
I'm now recording.
All right, let's drop in on this sick episode of Lucky Paper Radio. I'm Andy, and I'm here as always with my co-host, Birthday Boy Anthony Maddox.
That's what they call me.
Every week, I call you the Birthday Boy. Every week, your birthday is coming up or just recently passed.
Until the last one. Yep.
How do you feel about birthdays, Anthony? You're a year older.
I'm sure you will not be surprised to learn. I'm not. I don't care that much
you're just
about
apathetic.
birthdays.
Yeah. Well,
apathetic.
You're a year older, a year wiser. You're aging like a fine wine.
Wow.
We're all so lucky to have you in our podcast and in our lives.
Most wines don't actually age that well.
Holy crap, dude! You're gonna be pedantic about this?
To my age, I think I am over the hill for a wine.
Oh my god. Well, look, I'm going to need some support if I'm dealing with this level of pedantry. So, on the horn, we also have, of course, Parker Sandwich Daddy Lamascus. Hey, Daddy.
You're referring to the sandwiches I got you while you were here at MagicCon, and you said, I didn't believe the hype, but now anytime you offer me a sandwich, I'll take it because this is really good.
Well, most importantly, like, you just took care of us, Like, we didn't ask for anything. We didn't say, like, hey, Parker, what's good for lunch? You were just like, hey, I'm getting these sandwiches. Like, they're going to be here at this time. Be ready to eat them. And I really appreciate taking charge like that, being a real alpha, being a real daddy.
I spent all of the time that I would have spent on our roto draft instead planning the food. And I think it shows in the quality of the food and the quality of my roto draft deck.
What was your rating record? It wasn't that bad, right?
It was 2-7 or 3-6. Firmly
you were 2-7 too, Anthony?
I was 2-7. Yeah, that was pretty rough.
Yeah, turns out we're just a bunch of dumb content creators, whereas actual Magic players that are practiced and near professional, or in some cases former professionals, they're better than us. Turns out.
But the sandwiches, though, those were really delicious sandwiches. You also took us to get some spicy noodles. Andy, you missed that, but those were really excellent noodles. I appreciate having a local show us around town. Yeah, and for anybody who visits Philly, we're talking about the middle child. Excellent sandwiches, but you do have to order like 45 minutes ahead if you want it to be ready.
I was genuinely like, Parker's been talking about these sandwiches for 3 weeks. There's no way. Like, it's just going to be a sandwich. How good can it possibly be?
No,
people. I had to eat my words after I ate that sandwich because it was a really good sandwich. Both of them were great.
People line up out the door of that restaurant every single day to get those sandwiches.
What do you think the secret is? I mean, so I think they did something really admirably. Here's what I expect when someone tells me there's like a fancy high-end sandwich shop. I expect a comically large sandwich that you can't even eat, which I don't appreciate. It's like an Instagram sandwich that looks really good in pictures, but the practical eating of it is no good. These were very reasonably sized sandwiches, very practical.
Absolutely, and I think another key is that middle child bakes all their bread in-house, and they're only open as long as they have fresh bread. Yeah, if you show up and they don't have any more, ciabatta or whatever, you can't order that sandwich. So I think that another key is just freshness.
Look, whatever they're doing, it's working because those sandwiches were popping, and I'm very grateful for them. I'm very grateful for you for making it happen.
My pleasure.
It was a great weekend for us, for sure. And we're going to talk more about this rotisserie draft. I'm not sure if you know this, Parker, but we're going to have Justin on at some point, maybe next week's show, to kind of deconstruct this roto draft, talk about how it went for all parties, just unpack it generally, which should be a pretty good episode. It was a really fun roto draft. We had 10 people, and we only drafted 36 card pools, so it was a little bit different than past Roto drafts. It was also a lot of people that had not played the Cube before, which was pretty interesting. So lots to talk about there in an upcoming episode. But we can't do it right now because we have a lot on our docket. This is our part 3 of our Cube set review episodes. This is the community set review Cube survey results episode. Is that what we call it? I think I nailed it. This is where we are discussing the results of our community survey, which has been up for quite a long time mostly because of Magic Philly. We were distracted and didn't have time to close the survey and write the article and record this episode. So it was up for a nice long time. We got a big chunk of responses, and I'm excited to talk through them. I usually make Parker to explain it, but Anthony, do you want to explain how the survey works and our scoring system?
Absolutely. So we've been doing this for a while now, since Throne of Eldraine. I have no idea how time works. How long has that been? About 6 months?
3.5 years.
3.5 years. Okay, so we've been doing this for 3.5 years, where we survey...
Is that actually right now that I say it? Because it has to be, right? Because we're coming up on the 3-year mark of the pandemic. Eldraine was before the pandemic. I'm upset. But go ahead, continue. I'm sorry.
So we asked the community to tell us their first impressions of every new set, specifically for their cube environments, and to give us a list of all the cards they are interested in giving a try in their cube, and to rate each of those on a scale from 1 to 3. 1 being cards they are going to throw in their cube and see how they play, but they're a little bit skeptical of, and 3 being these are slam dunks they expect to be there forever. So we got about 350 responses, I think, for this set from the community, and excited to dive in and look at the results.
Yeah, and the important things here are we are not looking for some objective list of like the best cube cards. We want responses from everybody. So we have people that have set cubes, theme cubes, rarity restricted cubes, cubes that are only alliterative titles. We always go to that example. We got to pull some of the other more obscure examples of cube submissions, but we want explicitly a really broad brush here and look at the entire community and just kind of capture the cards that maybe just hit on a couple of different levels and just work for people.
Yeah, and then we take all those results, we compile them into a big list that you can see on the website, which we'll link to in the show notes, where we also graph them based on the number of people that are interested in a particular card, their average rating, so if people are really excited about it, or maybe they're a little bit more skeptical, and then also how divisive those cards were, so how widely spread apart those ratings were, to see if, the community is very much in agreement that this card is very exciting or very unexciting, or if it's a little bit less consistent.
How'd Anthony do, Parker?
I think you nailed it. We don't say a 3 isn't testing it forever and ever. It's I think the language you use is a 3 is a staple for years to come, however you define that. So it's not quite forever, but like if we're measuring in pandemics, it might as well be. So I get where you're coming from.
And we do allow people to download their past survey responses from the website. So if you've been responding for many years to the survey, you can go and check and see how many of those 3s you're still running. And if you're anything like me, it's not all of them. I'll tell you that much. There's definitely some of those 3s you've cut by now, which is an interesting opportunity to reflect and have a little bit of self-awareness, Yeah,
it's also interesting. We have people can put in whatever comments they want about the set, and I found that really interesting to go back and look at my past comments from the set, or, look at other individuals' comments from the past set and sort of see how their tone has changed, how they've interpreted different sets. So definitely would encourage anybody to go check that out.
Usually we talk beforehand about how many of these top cards we're going to cover, but we didn't. Do you want to do top 12?
Yeah, that sounds fine. We do need to make a couple of honorable mentions because I think we're going to have some interesting design discussion there.
No doubt.
My dishonorable mention is Melira, the Living Cure. It's green and a white for a legendary creature, Human Scout. If you would get 1 or more poison counters, instead you get 1 poison counter and you can't get additional poison counters this turn. And also, if you exile Melira, you can choose another target creature or artifact. When it's put into a graveyard this turn, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. Melira is a 3/3. So I think we just have to address poison for a minute.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, that's one of the core mechanics of the set. I think it's worth addressing.
Absolutely. And, I read over all the comments that we get from our community members who are submitting cards. And a very frequent refrain of our commenters was, I'm not testing any poison cards because poison is parasitic, it's linear, it's insular. There was a lot of adjectives used to describe this. But
yeah, I want to say that was roughly half of the comments included some form of that.
Yeah. So I think the community broadly is fairly down on this. But there's an interesting thing that I want to highlight with Melira specifically. On face value, Melira is a card that would be perfect for my cube. I run a lot of multicolored cards. I run very good fixing. And so the 2-mana 3/3 stat line is extremely influential and like useful in my format.
You love a Watch Wolf.
Yeah, in fact, in Brothers War, just like one set ago, I added Hajar, the Dauntless Bodyguard. It's another Watch Wolf with upside. In this case, the upside has to do with legendary creatures. You can sacrifice Hajar to give your other legends indestructible. I mean, that's kind of flavor text. I don't expect to be sacrificing my 3/3 very often in my cube, but it is vastly more important or more like reasonable of an upside than Melira's poison text in a format with 0 poison counters. So I think for me, one reason that poison has been so difficult to bring into my cube is because it just makes it so obvious that I'm adding complexity to my format with exactly 0 upside. And, I'm not entirely consistent here because I added Hajar from Brothers War, which is also roughly 0 upside, and it's a little bit of complexity there, but it's not exactly 0. And with Melira, it is. And it's why I just, this design irks me as a cube designer, and I think I'm not alone here in thinking this.
I feel like those two cards tell a little bit of a different story. Like the other card, you look at and you see the use case for it, even if it is fairly narrow, fairly unlikely to come up. I think that it's pretty easy for players to evaluate because it's referencing a card type that they're pretty familiar with. Whereas looking at this card, if you open it in a pack, you kind of have to ask yourself, is this text relevant? Is there going to be poison? And that is a much bigger question about the environment than are there going to be some random legendary creatures?
Right, like as the drafter, I mean, on one hand, I don't really care as the designer because I know all the cards in my cube. But if a brand new drafter sits down and this is in their first pack, Melira, they'll ask themselves, boy, do I have to worry about Infect in this format? Do I have to deploy blockers on turn 1 to guard against a Glistener Elf or whatever? In other words, complexity, if it's not adding actual gameplay novelty to a format, is strictly bad, I think, for a cube designer. And maybe you can push back if you disagree, but I think Melira's poison, in a format with no other poison, can only be distracting or, at best, meaningless. And that's not really a good look for my cube at this time.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty easy argument that text that literally doesn't affect gameplay being on the card is just a downside.
Right.
I wouldn't extend your comments to, like, adding any one card that references poison counters. I actually think some of these toxic creatures, and the results of our survey kind of reinforce this, are perfectly fine in a cube that doesn't have any other poison threats. It's just like, okay, here's a threat that hits reasonably hard on its own. It will also just attack your life total, but it has this extra layer of if this one threat hits you 3 times or whatever, or 4 times, regardless of what your life total is, even if you gained a bunch of life, you're still going to lose the game, which I think is kind of an interesting way to handle it. So while I agree with the text specifically on Melira, in an environment where there are no poison counters, I don't think that means that you can't have one poison card or one toxic card from this set in your otherwise poison-free cube and have it make sense. Yeah,
I think so much of this just comes down to expectations. If you had a card that was just, this is a 3-mana 3/3, if it hits your opponent 10 times, they lose the game. Maybe you use bounty counters or something that is obviously clearly just about that one card. I don't think people would see that so much as a downside, but definitely because there is some expectation that poison is a mechanic that exists on multiple cards and you're going to have a whole strategy based around it, it definitely changes the way people look at these cards because you expect to see it in a context where there are a lot of other things to pay off of it.
Yeah, I think that's true. And we'll talk a little more. I've conducted some additional analysis this time around because I was so curious about poison and how the cube community would receive this mechanic. So we have some data as we get to these cards that will reveal a little more here. And I'm looking forward to talking about that.
Mom, can we have Bedlam Reveler? We have Bedlam Reveler at home. The Bedlam Reveler at home, Vindictive Flamestoker.
I have at least one other thing I want to talk about that is not in the top cards of this particular set. I was a little bit surprised to see Sword of Forged Frontier, which is the green-red sword being added to the 2-color sword cycle. Coming in pretty low, it's the 36th most popular card in the entire set. Only 6.6% of our respondents are testing it. The rules text, it's got protection from red and green, it does stuff. I want to note this because I feel like this is a sign of maybe us reaching a sufficiently broad audience, or maybe people's attitudes towards cube design overall beginning to shift, because I feel like if you take this card and drop it in a set from 4 or 5 years ago, it's just people love the swords, right? People want to test all the swords in their cube. I feel like a lot of people have played the swords historically, and I'm glad to see a card like this, a flashy mythic. It's part of a relatively beloved cycle, but maybe doesn't have the best play patterns show up so low on the survey. I think that's a good sign.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. It fits a model of cards that we often see perform really well in that it is...
Exactly, yeah.
It is a cheap in terms of mana cost. It is a building off of a sort of known structure. It has this nice degree of familiarity that often leads people just to be very willing to try out cards. But I totally agree. I feel like the results this time are looking a little bit different. Like, we have a pretty broad range of interesting different kinds of cards at the top, from some of these splashy mythics to just, some efficient removal and some interesting, potentially synergistic small creatures. So yeah, I think I agree that the audience here is maybe shifting a little bit.
I mean, a little bit of a spoiler, of our top 5 cards, exactly 1 rare. The rest are commons and uncommons. So I think we're really actually collecting a pretty broad sampling of, here are the cards that work in a lot of cubes. They are like bread and butter commons that maybe fill a space that wasn't quite filled before by other cards in the past, as opposed to these maybe more narrow, interesting power outliers.
Rebel Salvo is cleaner than any card with affinity for equipment would imply. The 3-mana deal 5 to a permanent baseline was never really that bad in my cube when I ran Soul Scar, and between Reconfigure, Living Weapon, 4 Mirrodin, Barbed Spike style equipment, Battle for Zendikar Snap-on equipment, and any actual equipment that you do run, this can reasonably cost 2. Even if this effect isn't that good on balance, this is absolutely the kind of thing that I want to encourage in my cube.
Should we maybe just start at number 13? Because I think
that is
an interesting place to start.
Well, it's because 12 and 13 are tied, so which one is 12 and which one is 13
That's also a great
point. Toss-up. So we really got to do them both.
So, coming in at number 13 is Bloated Contaminator. This is 2 and a green for a 4/4 trample. It's a Phyrexian beast. It has Toxic 1, and whenever Bloated Contaminator deals combat damage to a player, proliferate. So it kind of has Toxic 2. This is the first, the highest up card in terms of the number of people testing it that has Toxic. So it's low, but not super low. But I think that this is just a good example of a card that sort of shows what kind of power level people are looking for that gets them over that hump of putting a card with Toxic in their cube. And that is a 3-mana 4/4 with trample that also doubles the Toxic. So it essentially just has to hit you 5 times and has potential for a bunch of other synergy with proliferate.
This card is wild to me, honestly.
Really pushed.
The fact that it's 2 and a green and not even like 1 green, like they made it
green,
so easy to cast. The stats are through the roof. It has all this text, and when you first see like the mana cost and the power and toughness, you're like, well, surely somewhere in all this text there's a downside. And no, it's all upside all the way through. Yeah, I totally get the appeal of this card for people that want to have powerful green 3-drops in their cube. This is kind of nuts.
Especially the trample combined with a combat trigger means it's going to be pretty easy to get that proliferate.
This also, I think, is a pretty tidy... Like, I really like that this hitting you 5 times either straight up, like just 4 times 5 is 20 life, or hitting you 5 times, as in 4 times Toxic plus Proliferate is 10 poison. I like that it's perfectly symmetrical. It's like, this thing hits you 5 times, you're dead, right? Which I think is kind of cool. And it's like, it gets around the fact that you could, chump block a little bit or gain some life and just say, no, you can hit 5 times at all. Even with 1 damage, you're dead. This thing is going to get you.
So, Bloated Contaminator, like Anthony said, is the most tested card that references poison or toxic in the entire set.
Though it's worth noting, Skrelv just 1 step below Bloated Contaminator here.
Very close. Yeah,
a little bit fewer testers.
Is that Mother of Runes type card. Now, this was very curious to me, or very interesting to me. I wanted to find out, okay, we have some people testing Bloated Contaminator. Is this 1 out of their 20 poison tests? Like, are they adding a poison theme to their environment? Or are we testing this because it's a 3-mana 4/4 and that toxic is like marginal upside, but it's going to be a complexity downside if it's the only toxic card in the format? And so I conducted this analysis. What I found is that 2/3 of our respondents aren't testing any toxic cards at all. Only 1/3 is testing a non-zero number of toxic, and that means that 2 of 10 of our testers are testing exactly 1 toxic. It's easy to get lost in the fractions here, but what I'm saying is only 10% of our respondents are testing more than one toxic card. Most people are testing exactly Skrelv or Bloated Contaminator and nothing else.
That kind of makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah.
Though I gotta say, another card I was surprised to see as low as it is on this list is Tyrannax Rex, which is 7 mana, 8/8, trample, ward 4, haste, toxic 4 that can't be countered. It's kind of a beefed up Carnage Tyrant. You know, I am not playing a cube these days that's in the market for a 7 mana like ramp payoff or cheat target, but I feel like there are still a lot of cubes that are in the market for that, right? And I'm a little surprised to see this one so low. It feels like this, much like Bloated Contaminator, would be perfectly fine to be one of the only or the only toxic/poison card in your entire environment, because it's, if you ignore the toxic line, it's just great, and then the toxic is just something on top of that, right? That just says, don't let it hit you 3 times or you die, which, I don't know. I was surprised to see this one as low as it was. I kind of thought this would be a somewhat popular, big, beefy boy amongst our respondents.
I'm pretty sure they printed a better big beefy thing in the same set. So there's an easy comparison to make to a card that we'll talk about later that looks a little bit more appealing. I think that might have something to do with it.
Kind of different, but sure, we'll get there.
One thing before I get off of this jag that I'm on about poison is Corrupted. So Corrupted is paired with Infect, or Toxic, new Infect, whatever, in Phyrexia All Will Be One. Corrupted, of course, triggers or is relevant when the opponent has 3 or more poison counters. So I want to talk about the most tested Corrupted card in the set. That's Skrelv's Hive, and only 10% of our respondents are testing Skrelv's Hive. It's an enchantment that makes a might every turn, and it has Corrupted to give your toxic creatures lifelink. In other words, Corrupted is another one of those instances where if the format has no toxic and has no poison counters, then Corrupted is an exactly meaningless line of rules text. On Skrelv's Hive, it's not exactly that case because the Hive makes toxic creatures, so it kind of turns itself on. But because of this obviously meaningless complexity, we have even fewer of our respondents testing any Corrupted cards at all. So I mentioned that 2/3 of our respondents are testing 0 toxic cards. Well, 90% of our respondents are testing 0 Corrupted cards.
And then 10% are testing Skrelv's Hive, and that's it, basically?
10% are... Yes, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, that's not a surprise to me at all.
I don't think so either. But, like, it's really interesting because Corrupted is the first time that I can remember where an ability can be exactly meaningless in a format. I mean, sure, I guess there's attractions and, like, contraptions and other outside the game resources, but Corrupted makes it really glaringly obvious that the Corrupted line of text just does not function unless you have a lot of poison cards in the environment.
Yeah, I mean, the mechanics that come to mind are like Devoid, which was the last time they did a keyword that literally had no effect really, except other cards could care about it, or I think in the same set, the Processors and the Ingesters, where you exiled cards and then could sort of use exiled cards from your opponent's library as a resource, but without sort of those two mechanics together, the cards didn't really function, or didn't add
Some
up
of them
to.
do.
Sure. So yeah, we're kind of seeing that again here with this kind of like input mechanic that just really needs some other cards to function, which, yeah, I mean, it makes perfect sense that the top one is a card that has both sides of that. It has the input and the output.
Yeah, so I guess the last thing I'll say about these pairs of linear mechanics from Phyrexia All Will Be One, is that I've been thinking about this, especially with regards to Melira in my own format. And I think that it's not just that poison and Corrupted are linear mechanics. Like, yes, the first poison card you add to a deck wants you to play additional poison cards. That is linear as a mechanic, but it's possible to have linear cards that have modular mechanics. Like, look at Savannah Lions. It's a 2/1 with no abilities. I mean, how modular is that? But it's still a very linear design. And by contrast, you could slap Infect on a Mother of Runes or an Esper Sentinel or something, and it would still be a pretty modular card. Essentially, what I'm thinking is that it's the play pattern that cube designers are wary of. It's linear play patterns. And the play patterns aren't just a function of the mechanic. I mean, that hurts, but it's also a function of the card design. And what we've seen in Phyrexia is that there are linear mechanics, yes, and in addition, the only modular designs are Bloated Contaminator, Skrelv, and other cards like that at very high power levels. So that's why I think that saying that these mechanics are linear and therefore unsuitable for Cube, it's not quite capturing all of the nuance that I've seen in this survey result.
Totally, and as we talked about last week, they did just print a ton of cards with a lot of these mechanics, so even if you're building a singleton environment, if you do want to lean into this, it's an option, but I think that a lot of people that are filling out this survey, they're really filling it out for existing cubes, so it's not really going to be the case where somebody's just going to easily say, I'm testing 40 of these toxic cards and similar, although we always get a couple big surveys.
Yeah, I actually know somebody at my LGS who was planning a Phyrexia-themed cube and is waiting until March of Machines, and I'm sure that they will have plenty of tests from Phyrexia All Will Be One when that happens.
Phyrexia All Will Be One has successfully given us 3, maybe 4 things, in my opinion. One of them being, it's good on rate removal, yay! The second one being, proliferate, stapled onto things that are already good. The third is another not quite Snapcaster Mage, and the fourth is Melira, which is just a Watchwolf with very good text. I personally am happy that we can just kind of take a rest and not worry about too much of this, and Proliferate might sneakily be really good on some of these cards.
All right, we got to get moving. We are on 13 of 13 and a half hour in. So next up is Conduit of Worlds, tied with Bloated Contaminator at 12.8% of our respondents testing it. This is 2 green for an artifact. It says you may play lands from your graveyard, and it has tap. Choose target non-land permanent card in your graveyard. If you haven't cast a spell this turn, you may cast that card. If you do, you can't cast additional spells this turn. Activate only as a sorcery. It's a Crucible of Worlds that has this ability stapled to it where if you'd like to have the only thing you do with your turn be casting 1 spell out of your graveyard, you can do that. And importantly, it doesn't exile the card, so you can just cast the same card every single turn if you want, as long as that's the only thing you're doing. It's kind of got some...
the epics?
The epics, thank you. Yeah, the epic spells
nice.
that basically just cast themselves and say you can't cast spells for the rest of the game.
It only casts permanents, so to recast the same thing every turn, you'd have to... sacrifice it somehow, but
yeah,
I don't know. I'm not really convinced about a 4-mana thing that doesn't do anything the turn it comes into play. I mean, it's as simple as that for me.
I think so. I was also surprised to see this so high up. I think maybe the just comparison to Crucible of Worlds, that it is just another copy of Crucible Worlds in a green deck if you're willing to pay 4 mana on it, which I think maybe that's contributing to a lot of why people are so interested in it, because, you know, there's only a few singleton cards that actually have that effect, so having more redundancy there maybe is something that people are actually looking for. And then I think I maybe overthought the fact that you can only do this once a turn, or you can only cast 1 spell a turn off of this, but that doesn't affect other spells you're playing. So it's only, like you're saying, if you do want to make that your turn, you have an option. So it's just upside on top of it being Crucible of Worlds. So I think I'm coming around to why people are potentially interested in this.
It's kind of cool. It does something a little bit different than what we've seen before, and I'm glad to see kind of quirky stuff like this higher on the list than just raw power outliers. So it's a cool card. I'm into it.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, I'm still Johnny Raincloud here, but it's not that high on the list, right? It's 13% of our respondents. And of course, that's high relative to the rest of Phyrexia, but people aren't testing a lot of cards from this set, like relative to other sets.
Yeah, there's plenty of sets where a card being tested by 13% of our respondents would be way down the list.
Right. Our next card is Drown in Ichor, or Ichor, or something.
Apparently it's Ichor, but I don't know.
Yeah, who knows? It is 1 and a black for a sorcery. Target creature gets -4/-4 until end of turn. Proliferate. It's tested by almost 15% of our respondents with an average rating of 2.2. So this is actually kind of interesting to me. It is the first time that we've ever gotten the -4/-4 effect at the 1 and a black mana cost. We've had Grasp in Darkness the last time we came to Mirrodin.
Yeah, that was
but that
black,
costs black, and it's an instant. So this is a novel combination of mana cost and kill spell effect, and it also has this proliferate bonus. So I think that's pretty modular and pretty appealing. In fact, I'm thinking about testing this myself, and I'm not alone in that. So we talked about how Toxic and Corrupted have been hampered in our survey results by their perceived linearity. And we talked about some reasons for that. Proliferate could not be further from that extreme. Again, just to contrast to Toxic, 2/3 of our respondents aren't testing any Toxic at all. 2/3 of our respondents are testing one or more Proliferate spells from Phyrexia All Will Be One. So it's the exact opposite.
I feel like we got a lot of cool bread and butter cards at reasonable rates with Proliferate stapled on them in this set.
Yeah, absolutely.
Relative to even past sets with Proliferate in it, where it was more like dedicated cards like Contagion Clasp or something. Now it's just, we see this removal spell. We're going to see another card in a second here that also just has Proliferate stapled to a very reasonable effect, and that's really appealing from a cube design perspective, I think.
Right, and Contagion Clasp is that example of Proliferate is a modular mechanic, but Contagion Clasp is a linear design that leads to linear play patterns. You're just killing stuff and maybe proliferating in the late game. Drown and Ichor is very different. It is modular all the way through. It invites you to play with other cards because it doesn't supply the counter itself. And so it's a very modular play pattern using a modular mechanic. And so it's no surprise that I think Proliferate is much better received than the other mechanics of this set.
Yeah, if I had anything resembling a +1/+1 counters matter or Planeswalker theme in my cube, I'd be all over cards like Drown and Ichor. And our next card, which is Experimental Augury. This is being tested by 15% of our respondents. It's 1 and a blue for an instant that says, look at the top 3 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand, and the rest on the bottom of your library in any order, proliferate. This is the Anticipate text exactly, plus proliferate, correct?
Yeah.
A very reasonable 2-mana cantrip in Anticipate. I've seen it played in plenty of cubes in the past. This is a strict upgrade over it in the sense that you can still do that, but if you have anything you want to proliferate, you have the option to do so now. And I think a great example of a card that has proliferate added to it without really changing the base rate of the card at all, right? Like, Anticipate's fine. It's not like Anticipate has been power crept out of printability. You can still see that at common in this set reasonably. But here we just get Anticipate with a little extra and with that proliferate stapled onto it. So I feel similarly about this as I feel about Drown and Ichor. If I care about counters, I'm all over cards like this.
Yeah, these cards seem pretty pushed to me, to be honest. I feel like in the past when we've seen Proliferate, it feels like it's like they take a half mana or mana cost reduction in terms of like what rate you expect to see on commons and uncommons. But these are just cards that you would see in a set and just be like, yeah, this is a solid card I'm going to play, which I think just does make it very appealing to cube designers that they can include reasonable cards that have this opportunity for cool interactions with proliferation.
Again, yeah, it's like kind of the opposite of Corrupted. Corrupted is upside that is very unlikely to come together, and Proliferate is upside that is very inviting and synergizes with tons of things already in the format.
I didn't mention this on Drown and Ichor, but I think having Proliferate at instant speed is a lot more powerful than most effects switch to instant speed, because obviously you get all the benefits of instant speed normally, in that you can do it in response to your opponent's stuff, you can hold up mana and do it on an end step or whatever, but also Proliferate in a lot of environments is going to be effectively a combat trick that you can just also buff a creature that has a +1/+1 counter on it. So the fact that Experimental Augury is an instant, they didn't like downgrade it to a sorcery in exchange for the Proliferate text, I think is very notable.
All right, next up we have Vraan Executioner Thane. This is 1 and a black for a 2/2 for a legendary creature Phyrexian vampire. Whenever one or more other creatures you control die, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. This ability triggers only once each turn. This is just a nice simple card that I think is going to be very powerful in aggressive decks. It's not, an instant win combo piece where you just sacrifice your board and drain your opponent because it is only going to trigger once a turn, but it can still do a lot of damage and sort of turn a go wide strategy into a real win condition.
I think it's a really cool twist on Blood Artist style effects because it has a perfectly reasonable body on its own as a 2-mana 2/2. The 2-mana life swing instead of the 1-mana life swing is double. That's a lot more. But in exchange, you lose some of the ceiling kind of combo stuff that you can see with Blood Artist type effects, which I think does encourage a different type of gameplay, or at least signals to your drafters a different type of gameplay. It's like you're not going all in on looping your Gravecrawler 6 times a turn, and that's how you're going to end the game. It's more like, yeah, you're going to have a deck with some sacrifice stuff going on, maybe not entirely all in, and this really pays you off for that.
I mean, even just in any aggressive deck, I feel like you just play this before combat and attack, and suddenly you're kind of making your other like proactive cards just unblockable in a way.
I'd definitely be more excited to play this in a proactive deck that happens to have sacrifice synergy,
Right.
kind of like a
Yeah,
regular
absolutely.
cube deck.
Because they just block
Rel-
this, right? If
Yeah.
you're going to block anything and trade with it, or have removal spell,
Right,
they're just going to block
that's
and
why
trade
I
with
say
this.
the turn you cast it, you play this and then attack.
So you get either like one turn of a weird kind of evasion effect, or maybe you drain them for 2. The fact it doesn't trigger on itself is relevant for that particular use case you laid out.
For sure.
But it's also got 2 power, and so it just does a
Right.
better job of beating down than Blood Artist.
For sure.
Yeah, and so that's why I say, like, if I were a red aggressive deck splashing black sacrifice stuff, I'd be interested in this, maybe over Blood Artist, depending on the deck. I think that brings us to number 8 on our list, which is Nissa Ascended Animist. Now, this is going to be a mouthful. You can cast her for 3 green, and then she also costs 2 Phyrexian green, and she has the ability Completed. So the Phyrexian green can be paid with life, and if you do so, it enters with 2 fewer loyalty counters per Phyrexian green paid that way. So she starts with 7 loyalty, or 5 or 3, depending on how cheap she is. She has a +1. Create an XX green Phyrexian horror creature token where X is her loyalty. She has a -1. Destroy target artifact or enchantment. Thank goodness that one was easy to say. And she has a -7. Until end of turn, creatures you control get +1/+1 for each forest you control and gain trample. Okay, so this is tested by 17% of our respondents with an average rating of 2.2. And I can see why. It's modal in the sense that you can cast it at 3 different points on the curve. And it's also highly aspirational because that ultimate is achievable if you hit the 7 mana. And it promises to be game-winning in a really spectacular fashion, in a way that'll really make you feel, powerful and cool for doing it. So I totally get why this is an exciting effect. I think I would test it if I happen to open one in draft. I'm not sure that it's more powerful than Nissa Who Shakes the World. In fact, I'm kind of certain it's not. But it's more aspirational because she promises to do really cool things in a way that the other Nissa maybe doesn't.
It's got a lot going on for sure.
Yeah.
Friend of the show, Alex, I think mentioned this to me and kind of suggested this as a more modal, interesting alternative to Craterhoof Behemoth, which is a card I still run in my cube, even though, as I said earlier, I'm not really interested in, 7 and 8 mana giant payoffs for ramp. And truthfully, I found that in my cube, with exactly Craterhoof Behemoth and I think nothing else above 5 mana in green, I'm sorry, I do have Primeval Titan as well, but that's kind of in there for the Field of Dead deck. With really just those 2 cards, that's enough for people to sometimes occasionally draft a big green deck, which, I don't expect Craterhoof Behemoth to get played at every single draft, but when someone does want to do that, I like that deck is kind of enabled by just the presence of that one card, essentially. But on paper, Nissa certainly aligns with more of my cube goals than Craterhoof does, because it still has that Craterhoof ceiling, right? You still just cast it for 3, green. Did I say green the right number of times?
I think so.
3 and
greens.
4 green. You cast it for 3 and 4 green, and very likely you'll have 4, 5, 6 forests in play, most likely, and you just give your entire board the biggest overrun since the beginning of time, and you get to crush your opponent with it. Which actually, in a lot of ways, is going to scale better than Craterhoof. Like a Craterhoof on a board of 2 creatures, sometimes one end of the game, but I think very often Nissa on a board of 2 creatures just will, which is something to note. I really get it from that perspective. It is complicated. It's got a lot going on. I think the completed mechanic is a lot of mental overhead to kind of get over, especially if you only have it in one instance across your cube. And, the rest of it is just kind of uninspiring to me, but I totally get the appeal of you can cast this for 5 mana and 4 life relatively early in the game and start churning out 3/3s and then a 4/4 and then a 5/5. Or you can play this for 6 mana and 2 life and, I don't know. It has a lot of different ways you could potentially play it with that ceiling of just blow them out of the water with a giant overrun ability. So
it is really complicated to try and evaluate the completed ability in the Phyrexian mana because you're kind of balancing 3 resources all at once. It's not just, can I afford to pay life for a little bit of a tempo boost here? It's, can I afford to pay life for this tempo boost, but also then I'm losing this other resource of the loyalty counters, and it does get really complicated to try and sort of figure out where you want to be playing this in your curve.
Here's a question. If you took the life loss out of it, if you just said you can cast this for 5 or 6 or 7 mana, and, it comes in with the respective amount of loyalty, where do you expect this would most often get cast on curve?
6?
I think probably 5.
5?
I don't know. It's a
I
mobile
wanna
spell.
cast it
I
at
think
7,
you just
but-
like do whatever, like spend your mana as best as you can, as much of your mana as you can every turn until you can't do that, and then you cast Nissa at whatever point of the curve you happen to be on. So like if you have another 5-drop, you'll play Nissa as a 6. If you have 2 3-drops on turn 6, you'll play those and then play Nissa on 7.
And in this world, you keep drawing lands every single turn.
Right.
Well, hopefully, because then you get to make a bigger overrun with Nissa.
That's true. It's true.
The life loss doesn't really change the calculus for me.
Yeah, that's kind of why I asked. Like, I think you'll play this on 5 very often. If it's your only 5 mana play and you're staring down the like possibility of either like playing a 2-drop on your 5 mana turn or passing and doing nothing, you'll definitely just play Nissa every single time, right? That 4 life is rare. I mean, I guess maybe against like a super burn deck, that 4 life is actually something you should be scared of, but usually it's like you'd much rather just have a giant planeswalker in play. It's got a really, I think it has a potent cool factor, right? The completed planeswalkers are very cool. I don't really get into the lore stuff of Magic, but I will say that I kind of hope, here's my hope for where we go with Magic. I hope that at the end of this whole story arc, they're like, yep, all your favorite planeswalkers are completed. They're basically dead. They're just like evil demon creatures now. And then we just start over again. Here's a brand new Magic story, right? Like in the early days of Magic, we had the whole like Weatherlight saga and all that stuff. And then when, Lorwyn dropped, it was kind of like, and here's a new Magic story. And we're going to kind of forget about all of those people except for callback sets, which we're going to do in ever increasing density because they're so popular. But I think it'd be cool if we just like, yep, sorry, all the Jaces and Vraskas and Nissas and Chandras, that's not a thing we do anymore. Now we have new characters. I don't think they're going to do that. But
Jace is so lightly completed. He doesn't look all that complete, to be honest.
I don't think they're going to do that, but I think if they did, it would be sick, and it would make this card that much cooler. They're like, here it is. Here's the end of Nissa. All those Nissa cards you've ever seen, this is what it led to. Now, Parker, did you, when we were talking about Tyrannax Rex earlier, were you talking about Nissa Ascended Animist or this next card on our list?
I was definitely talking about Atraxa.
So the next card here is Atraxa Grand Unifier. It is 3 green, white, blue, red. So 3 and everything. I said red.
This is the one mana symbol you didn't want to happen.
It is 3 green, white, blue, black. So 3 and everything but red for a legendary creature, Phyrexian Angel. It is a 7/7 with flying, vigilance, death touch, and lifelink. And when Atraxa Grand Unifier enters the battlefield, reveal the top 10 cards of your library. For each card type, you may put a card of that type from among the revealed cards into your hand, put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order, and importantly, we see in the reminder text here that Battle is a new card type we are presumably going to get in March of Machine. The March of the Machine. It's actually not plural. Did you realize that? It's the March of the Machine.
I've just been calling it Mom.
I guess it kind of makes sense, right? Because the Phyrexians are like, they're
One.
one. All will be one.
Yeah,
It's March of the Machine.
It's right in the previous title.
It's right in the thing. I thought it was interesting. I mean, they did talk about this on... I think Mark Rosewater has addressed this on his blog, but they didn't include Tribal in the list of card types here. And I think he said they're not getting rid of it, but they're not going to come back to it.
It's very weird to me.
They just didn't include it in the reminder text, which seems very strange to me, but they did include Battle, so
it's like
that's the thing.
I mean, they must have, I'm sure, a better sense of this, that, Tribal just doesn't matter so much in the formats that people actually play. It's easier just to ignore it, and, then people don't have to worry about what is Tribal. But you know what format people do play a lot of that involves all kinds of old weird cards is Commander.
How many Tribal cards do you think see playing Commander
all right,
often?
Bitter Blossom.
Is it that Commander?
Tarfire, people play that in Commander
people
all
do
the
not
time.
play Tarfire in Commander, buddy. Well, let's throw over to our resident degenerate combo player that knows everything there is to know about cheaty decks and Randomator and stuff. Anthony, what do you think of Atraxa compared to Gristlebrand, compared to Archon of Cruelty, and all of the best cheat targets you've seen in the past?
I had a great time casting this at my pre-release just with a bunch of basic lands.
Did you really?
I did. Unfortunately, I didn't draw it as often as I wanted to, so I had my mana worked out perfectly. I had it all set up. And I just never drew the card except for maybe twice. This card is a lot of power. I feel like the other thing I've seen this compared to a lot is Niv Mizzet Reborn, just in terms of, reveal a bunch of cards from the top of your library and draw a bunch of them based on some constraints. But the constraint here is so much easier,
Yeah, this is barely a constraint. Every deck have cards.
Every deck's going to have cards. You don't have to specifically go out of your way to find 2-color gold cards. It's got flying, it's got vigilance, it's got life, it's got everything you want.
I think it's a lot closer to Grizzlebrand than it is
close
to
to
Niv Mizzet Reborn.
Yeah.
And right now there's a lot of discussion in the Legacy world about, is this better than Grizzlebrand? Which is fascinating because for however long Grizzlebrand's been in print, like 10, 12 years at this point, like that was the reanimator target. That's what you go and get.
Right.
Archon of Cruelty definitely challenged the throne a little bit, but as I understand it, kind of everyone landed eventually in Legacy that, you play one of those, maybe you get it, you're given a given board state, but you still play a 4X Grizzlebrand. But this, it's something you can pitch to Force in Legacy, which is relevant. For cubes, you can get it with Natural Order if you're playing Natural Order in your various cheat strategies, which is something. It's going to draw you the cards regardless of what your life total is. There's sometimes where you can't draw with Grizzlebrand unless you can hit with it, which you can't always do. So it's going to always give you card advantage in that sense. And then the body, I mean, Flying Vigilance, Death Touch, Life, like that's a lot of text. It's going to brawl with pretty much anything on the board, no matter what the situation is. So I think this is a premium cheat target for anybody that cares about cheat targets. I even passively considered it for the Degenerate Microcube, and I think might come back to it, honestly, in the future, depending on how things shake out.
Yeah, I think it's a lot more, like, the floor is a lot higher than Grizzlebrand, because Grizzlebrand, if you're below 7 life, you can't really use it. You can't really necessarily get that life back. There are some weird cases where this is always just going to generate a lot of value, gain you some life, and I think it's just going to do the thing you want to do all the time, but I don't think it has, like, the super extreme combo potential that Grizzlebrand has. So I think it's just, if you're already in this sort of cheaty theme in your cube, you might want one or the other based on exactly what flavor of kind of gameplay you like, but I think that this is going to play in a very powerful way that's going to be pretty similar.
Yeah, I should mention before we move on that Atraxa is the highest rated card.
I was just going to say, yeah.
On the top 10 or 12 that we're discussing today. And I think that is in no small part due to Atraxa's legacy play that she's been seeing.
Oh, interesting. I honestly think it's just because I think Atraxa is very plainly one of the best cheat targets we've ever gotten. I think the 18.5% of our respondents that are testing it is roughly probably the number of cubes that care to test a cheat target. And I think everyone testing it is very confident it's going to be good, which is why it's ranked so high in the score, because for the cubes it's right for, it's very, very right for them.
Right, yeah.
Yes, and we're also a couple weeks later with this analysis than usual, and so I think we've been getting, like, there's enough time in there to get feedback from the people who are testing constructed and get that constructed feedback, which we know has a big effect on cube inclusion. Did that make any sense?
Totally.
Okay, yeah.
And also, cool art.
Yeah,
it's cool to
sick.
have a giant Phyrexian angel. Makes sense. Very cool. I think the play patterns people are talking about with Atraxa, Anthony, that people are excited about is very often you can Atraxa into your next Atraxa and then just do it all over again.
Great.
And so you don't stop at drawing N cards from the top 10. You stop at drawing N times 2 cards from the top 20. And just kind of like, you can actually kind of chain them together and go off in a similar explosive fashion as you can with Grizzlebrand. At least is the idea, I think.
The one fun thing I did get to do at the pre-release is I cast this, drew a bunch of cards. My opponent was...
That is fun.
Story over. It was great. My opponent was still in a pretty good position to, punch me back and take over the game. They cast Ossification, exiling Atraxa, and then I had a bounce spell the next turn to bounce Ossification, draw a bunch more cards, and that was great. So what's better than drawing a bunch of cards? Drawing a bunch of cards twice. All right, next up we have another pretty wordy card, the Eternal Wanderer. This is 4 white, so 6 mana for a legendary planeswalker. Starts with 5 loyalty. No more than one creature can attack the Eternal Wanderer each combat is its static ability. It has +1, exile up to 1 target artifact or creature, return the card to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the player's next end step.
That player's next end step is different than the next end step, which is important to note.
0 to make a 2/2 samurai creature token with double strike, and -4 for each player. Choose a creature that player controls. Each player sacrifices all creatures not chosen this way. So basically, destroy all but one creature from each player, and it gets around indestructible and stuff like that.
Cataclysm for just creatures, basically.
Brutal.
This card does a lot.
A brutal control finisher. Like, not just good, but also demoralizing. And sometimes that's what you want.
Yeah,
Definitely a huge bomb, yeah.
Love the sound of this card. I think especially just that static ability seems really, really punishing in a lot of matchups.
Being tested by almost 20% of our respondents, a score of 2.1. I think that +1 is really interesting because it is not quite what we've seen before from similar sounding abilities, right? You're going to flicker something during your turn on at sorcery speed, presumably, because it's activating a Planeswalker loyalty ability, except for weird circumstances where you can do that in other times. So if you target your opponent's thing, it goes away for the remainder of your turn and your opponent's entire turn. So you can just essentially keep plussing on the same thing, and they never get to use it unless they can use it at instant speed on your turn, before you hit it again with the +1 ability, which is kind of interesting. Obviously, I think it's also got the cool lines of blinking your own stuff for value, which people love to do. And then, yeah, that -4 is pretty devastating. It's interesting as a control finisher because it doesn't actually work on an empty board on your side with your opponent having a lot of creatures, right? Like I'm picturing Elspeth's Son's Champions, downtick ability gets rid of all the big creatures basically, which sometimes is board wipe, right? You play your giant planeswalker, you wipe the board, now you have a planeswalker on an empty board. This really rewards you for having one other creature, right? Which you could get from the Eternal Wanderer if you can make a 2/2 and then pass the turn and then downticker. But it's interesting that it's a control finisher that wants you to have not only a creature, but a creature better than any of your opponent's creatures in play. So you get to choose, right? So you just let them keep their dumbest creature, and you keep your best creature.
Well,
All
so
these
your
abilities
creature
are really
only
good.
has to be better than their worst creature. Kind of you only need to be not the slowest person outrunning a bear.
Exactly.
Yeah. Of note, looking at this card, I'm realizing that they've made the Planeswalker text box more transparent so that you can see more of the art, which is a frame change since, I don't know when they started this, but this is the first time I'm noticing it. It kind of makes it hard to read.
Maybe it's just like especially high contrast art, and it's kind of been that way for longer than we think, but it's very noticeable here because of that like lava flow, I guess, below her.
I don't know. Nissa's also really tough to read.
I think Nissa especially, the way that like detailed Phyrexian vein texture happens to clash and line up with the text, it makes it particularly hard to actually read the letters. So yeah, I don't know. I feel like this Planeswalker is another of a long line of somewhat interchangeable control or mid-range finishers. It's like, yeah, this card's going to be great if you get to resolve it. It's not many board states it's bad in. It also, to my mind, doesn't have anything hugely unique about it. I mean, the Cataclysm ability relative to other either board wipe effects or just flooding the board with tokens as a means of protection is maybe interesting. But yeah, I don't know. I feel like all these cards, it's hard to like evaluate them because you're not sliding it into a new kind of strategy. It doesn't enable new kinds of things. It's just like, here's another big card that if you cast it and it sticks, you'll probably win the game eventually. Is that overly cynical?
No. I mean, when we conduct our retrospective analyses, we see that these kinds of cards will have a lot of attrition, usually.
Yeah,
and I think
would
it's
expect
for that reason. I mean, they are interchangeable. And also, the Eternal Wanderer is going to be ending games. So in other words, you're going to experience its full range a lot if you choose to include this in your cube. It's going to end games for a matter, months. And then by the time the next 6-drop comes out, you'll be tired of the Wanderer ending games, and so you'll be ready for the switch. That's my theory, at least.
Yeah.
Our next card is Ossification. It is a 1 and a white enchantment aura. It enchants a basic land you control, and when it enters the battlefield, exile target creature or planeswalker an opponent controls until it leaves the battlefield. It's tested by almost a quarter of our respondents with an average rating of 2.2. So we get a version of Chained to the Rocks, or, like a 2-mana pacifism O-ring kind of effect, updated for the modern era. It exiles planeswalkers, not just creatures. So it's obviously powerful, obviously an upgrade on Oblivion Ring in some ways. It has an interesting tension because it only enchants basic lands, and so some cubes might have a little bit of deck building tension there in a good way. But overall, my prevailing thought on this card personally, new Magic cards are competing with the rest of the cube, competing with 30 years of design elegance. A card like Oblivion Ring, even though it's maybe a little weaker, is extremely elegant. Or maybe Banishing Light is a better example. I
think Journey to Nowhere is the best example. That is
Journey to Nowhere.
That's the 2-mana Oblivion Ring that only hits creatures. Here, you get to also hit planeswalkers, but you have to have a basic land in play and not lose it.
And it's no fuss. Unlike Ossification, where from your opponent's side of the battlefield, it might look like you have another basic land hidden under there or something. Like, a new card is competing with 30 years of elegance and also adding to 30 years of complexity. Like any of the Oblivion Ring flicker shenanigans that your cube supports, or all of the extremely complicated removal spells that we've gotten over the years, like Chain Lightning or whatever. And I don't know, that dual tension where you're adding to the complexity threshold of your cube and also competing against all of the elegant designs that have come before. For that reason, I'm like not as excited about Ossification as I would have been even like a year ago.
Yeah, I don't know if it was you, Anthony, that mentioned this, but Parker alluded to it. I think the practical implications of this card are kind of hugely annoying. Like, you have to now put an aura in with your lands, which, you know, you have to indicate which one it's attached to, and if you have anything in your environment anywhere that could potentially mess with lands, and it's obviously really important to indicate that and know where it is, you don't want to put a permanent down there. It feels like a bad place to put a permanent. Also, it tends to be the furthest. I mean, this sounds like such trivial stuff we're talking about, but it's like that's your collection of cards that is furthest from your opponent. So usually when I like Oblivion Ring something, I'll put the Oblivion Ring essentially like in the no man's land in between our two board states to make sure at the end we like both take our card back, right? And I don't end up shuffling your card into my deck. Here, it kind of has to be all the way over on my side of the board under this thing. I guess you could just put it off to the side and remember the thing you have off to the side is exiled by this thing, but that little practical hiccup, again, with all of the other options we have, Parker, in the history of Magic, is something that will keep me off of this card, I think. But I do understand why people are so excited about it. I think a lot of people have been upping the density of Planeswalkers over the years as we get more and more novel designs, and so now your Journey to Nowheres, they don't hit a lot of threats, right? If you're the control deck playing Journey to Nowhere and your opponent plays a Planeswalker, it feels kind of bad that your removal can't remove the threat you care about at that moment. So it makes a lot of sense to me why people are excited about it. It's not for me because of that little pragmatic hiccup.
I mean, I think you're right. Like, I just listened to a Drive to Work about mental processing, which Mark Rosewater said is the flip side of logistics, which is just like the physical embodiedness of the Magic experience. Like, we have to move cards around on a table, and that comes with complexity. And so, yeah, I mean, Mark is thinking about it, and so I don't think it's inappropriate for cube designers to think about it either.
Yeah, I mean, you say it's a small nitpick, but, like, that's one of the best things about Cube is we get to be nitpicky, and, like, if you exclude a card for whatever reason you want, the environment still works, and everybody's, you know, still on the same playing field. It's not the same as showing up to a constructed tournament and excluding the best removal spell because you don't like the way it plays. That would be ridiculous, obviously. But I think that those logistics are legitimately very annoying. Like, I'm not going to enjoy thinking about how many basic lands are in my deck and, you know, is this card going to be worth playing? And I kind of like
that part, I will say.
I don't. I'm not going to enjoy the moments where it just feels like randomly, I just can't use my removal spell because of the hand that I drew. It's just kind of, it feels like too much of a roll of the dice. And
yeah, I happen to not get mana screwed this game, and therefore I can't use my removal spell.
Right. I mean, I could see definitely.
That's interesting. I feel like you're often defending downsides like that. Like, I feel like I'm the one that's always like, I don't want my card to not work for some random reason. And you're like, no, it's part of the challenge. You should have drafted differently or played differently.
I mean, random downside of like, I don't have a creature, so I don't get to use my combat trick feels so differently than the complete arbitrariness of just like, I'm designing my mana base so my mana works. It feels different.
I don't think it's going to like change the number of basics you put in your deck. I think it's going to change the kind of deck you put it in. Like, I don't think you're likely to jam Ossification in like a 5-color good stuff deck because you probably want to be on very few basics in that deck. And even if you're in pack 1 and maybe you already have your Bring to Light and your Niv Mizzet, so you know you're going 5 colors, I don't think you're taking Ossification basically ever because you don't expect to have basic lands in play to put this on the board. But if you're just playing a 2-color control deck or something, I don't think you have to like cut fixing lands from your deck because you're worried about this not being live. I think you just play in a 2-color deck on most mana bases and you're probably fine. Especially in an environment with fetch lands where you oftentimes have the option of fetching up a basic if you prefer. That is, I think, going to be fine in a lot of situations. So for my own taste, I actually like that restriction. I think it's kind of like the opposite motivation we see on something like Prismatic Ending, which says like, hey, maybe splash a 3rd color. Just maybe. Because maybe you'll get to, you know, Prismatic Ending, a 3-mana Planeswalker or something. Here, this is like, maybe don't splash that 3rd color because actually you're going to want to cast this spell at a reasonable time.
I don't know. I just feel like Chain to the Rocks was such a cool top-down design, and that kind of turned into this template for, you know, then we saw, what was it called? On Thin Ice that enchanted a Snowland. This kind of like weird template for these kinds of cards, which I just don't love, and I don't think the flavor is there like it is on Chain to the Rocks to really to make it meaningful to me.
Because Chain to the Rocks references that Prometheus myth where, he is chained to the rocks. And
Exactly.
Is it an
Chained to
eagle
a
that
mountain.
pecks out his liver?
Eagle, vulture, some kind of bird.
Yeah, sounds painful.
But this is the community set review, so it's not about me. Almost a quarter of our respondents are testing this card. It makes sense. It's powerful, it's efficient, and it's going to do most of the time what you need it to.
My hot take is aimed at Vindictive Flamestoker and Mercurial Spelldancer, but kind of extends to the set as a whole. Namely, both of those cards really good on a first reading, and then they come down significantly once you actually parse all the text, which is really how I felt about oil counters, poison counters, but not poison the mechanic, or infect the mechanic, because now it's called toxic, corrupted, or whatever it is when there's too many poison counters. Magic cards, they got too many words that require too close of a reading these days. All right, I'm outside with my dog right now, so I'm just going to go back to yelling at the clouds. Take care, y'all.
Our next card is the only rare or mythic we find among the top 5 cards, according to the community from Phyrexia All Be One, and it is Mercurial Spelldancer. 1 and a blue for a creature Phyrexian Rogue. It's a 2/1, and Mercurial Spelldancer can't be blocked. When you cast a non-creature spell, put an oil counter on Mercurial Spelldancer, and whenever Mercurial Spelldancer deals combat damage to a player, you may remove 2 oil counters from it. If you do, when you cast your next instant or sorcery spell this turn, copy that spell. You may choose new targets for the copy. We talked about this a little bit in our personal Cube Editions episode, Anthony. I actually did edit in a little addendum just because I was kind of processing that card on air and it was kind of inelegant, but the more I think about this card, the more I think it's very powerful. It has, I think, more similarities to something like a Dreadhorde Arcanist than it does to a Seagate Stormcaller because of the promise of turn over turn card advantage with no additional mana investment. Like, you just do the thing you're already doing and you just get to continue to draw cards, essentially. And the cards you're drawing are spells you're copying, much like with Dreadhorde Arcanist, the cards you're drawing are spells already in your graveyard. But I think it's a potentially very powerful card. I think some people also are missing on this card, and I might have said in the last episode, I can't remember, that when you cast the spell you end up copying, that will still also put a counter on Mercurial Spelldancer, right? So it kind of, if you can keep hitting with it, just copies every other spell you cast, right? Now, it's weird because it triggers on non-creature spells to put the oil counters on, but you can only copy instant and sorcery spells, which I assume is because they didn't want you to make, like, tokens of your Mishra's Baubles or whatever, because that would be strange.
Because that would just be weird.
But you can copy a ton of stuff with this card if you can keep hitting with it, and I think it's going to be a huge threat once it's in play.
Andy, is that true? Because I know the Magecraft template says whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, do this. I think copying might not be casting. But maybe I'm wrong.
It's not. I just mean that I think people don't realize that. So they're thinking like, oh, I cast 2 spells, then I cast a 3rd spell, and that one gets copied. And that's the cycle. That 3rd spell you cast is already the first of your next 2 spells for the next time you get to do this thing. So
Understood.
You're kind of like, I think the rhythm or the sort of tempo of this thing is something people are maybe misinterpreting. You get to copy it almost every other spell, basically.
Yeah. Now, this one is definitely impacted by Constructed. I first did this analysis like a couple weeks ago, before Mercurial. It's
really hard to say this word.
I can't say this name. Before the Spelldancer was seeing much play, and it was not as high up on the list. So I do think we've gotten some last-minute submissions that have seen this card in action in Constructed and bumped it up in the ratings.
I still don't know how much fun it's going to be to play with this card. From a design perspective, the other thing I really like about it is, as someone that does have Dreadhorde Arcanist in my cube, and I would call that card like a staple of the kind of cube I'm trying to design. I can't imagine cutting that card in any reasonable free future. This does have different kinds of motivations, right? With Arcanist, you really want as many 1-mana spells in your deck as possible. It doesn't matter how dinky. Like, put all the 1-mana cantrips in there, put all the 1-mana tiny little burn spells. Whatever you got, it's better to have something to copy than nothing. And this, given that you get to copy the thing regardless of mana value, right? You're just going to get to copy your treasure cruise that you delve away your deck for. Or you're going to get to copy something like a Collective Brutality, which you can escalate, and the copy maintains the escalated modes without having to discard additional cards. I think this card rewards you for being a little more optimistic and dreaming big about the kinds of spells you put in your deck, because copying big spells is so much better than copying small spells, and this is not at all paying any mind to the mana value of the things you're casting.
It's a good point.
Anyway, I'm really excited to copy things like K Command and Cryptic Command and Archmage's Charm and just like spells that have a high ceiling and are more expensive with this card, which as of right now don't get copied with things like Dreaded Arcanist or Seagate Stormcaller or even Snapcaster Mage. Because I mean, to copy a Cryptic Command with Snapcaster Mage, I've done it, but it's hard. You got to get to 6 mana with 4 blue. This, you just got to get your Cryptic Command. As long as you can cast it, you can copy it.
I mean, you could always just put Grafted War Gear on Dreadhorde Arcanist.
You could do that. And those 2 cards are in my cube, Anthony. I implore you, do it. I'd love to see someone do it.
All right. I'll do it. Looking forward to it.
That sounds spicy.
Next up, we have Planar Disruption. This is 1 and a white for an enchantment. It's an aura, enchant artifact, creature, or planeswalker. And enchanted permanents cannot attack or block, and its activated abilities can't be activated. I feel like we're just seeing the suite of, basic removal spell, plus it also hits planeswalkers this time.
Yeah.
And that's, going to turn out to be, 4 of the top 5 or 3 of the top 5 cards in this list?
I think this is great. Pacifism, but also for planeswalkers is really cool. I did look at this for my own cube, and just basically what I was looking at is how many of the cards in my cube are threats that are going to accumulate value if they don't have to attack and their activated abilities don't have to be activated. And after looking at it, I think I might come back to it and actually test this thing. It wasn't on my initial testing list. It wasn't part of my survey submission, but it's clean, it's tidy, and it does what it says on the card, which is exciting.
Yeah, it's being tested by more than a third of our respondents, 34%, with a pretty high rating as well of 2.3.
Good card is good. Thoughts on it, Parker?
No thoughts. Head empty.
Smooth brain.
I mean, I do like that, it's Arrest, but a full mana cheaper plus the Planeswalker mode. And I don't think Arrest hits artifacts either. So
wow, Parker, you're showing how young you are by saying it's Arrest but 1 mana cheaper instead of saying it's Pacifism, which is the iconic classic card that already costs 1 and a white.
Well, I mean, but Pacifism never turned off the abilities. So I think Arrest is just a cleaner comparison.
Sure.
Yeah, and I think that is going to be relevant. We see more and more creatures that have activated abilities on them, and I feel like Pacifism, in a lot of context, feels like this card doesn't actually really work, because I'm not just trying to hit your big creature. I'm trying to stop your, utility.
You can't pacify the bird.
Exactly.
But you can Planar Disruption the bird.
It even stops mana abilities, right? So yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like
activate them.
Just disrupt that bird's plane of existence. Just mess it up.
All right, yeah, I mean, I'll have to give it a try if I find one. You've convinced me. Speaking of flexible and strictly better removal spells, our second most tested card from Phyrexia, All Will Be One, is Sheoldred's Edict. This is 1 and a black for an instant. Choose 1. Each opponent sacrifices a non-token creature, a creature token, or a planeswalker. It is tested by more than a third of our respondents with an average rating of 2.2. So this is obviously an improvement on Diabolic Edict and many of the edicts which have come afterwards. It solves a major problem of edict effects, which is tokens. You can force them to either sacrifice a real card, presumably, or if the token's really huge, like Merit Lodge or something, then you can have them sacrifice that instead. So yeah, that's Sheoldred's Edict. I have no doubt that it's buoyed by that clean comparison to an older, strictly worse effect, as well as its low rarity, which makes it eligible in a wider variety of cubes.
I feel like I can almost hear them designing this card where they're like, there's so many tokens in Magic today, a straight-up Edict doesn't really function the same way as it did when we first printed Diabolic Edict, so let's allow you to force an opponent to sacrifice a non-token creature. But what if they have a token you really want them to sacrifice? So they give you that option as well. And then, like we've been saying with all of these cards, we just see the option to deal with planeswalkers more.
Yeah, I really think this is just the spirit of Diabolic Edict, which was playable once upon a time, updated for the modern era, because there are so many more tokens now, and there are more threats that are not creatures now, right? Back in the days when Diabolic Edict was good, it got rid of everything that could kill you. That was kind of the whole point of it. And now there's all these planeswalkers that are just as, if not more threatening than creatures. So, yeah, and in some ways, it's going to be better now than Diabolic Edict was then because, let's say back in the day they had 3 creatures and you didn't have any choice. They had the choice of which 3 to sacrifice. Now, if they have a creature, a planeswalker, and a creature token, you essentially get to destroy whichever one you want, get around indestructible and all that kind of stuff if you want to, which I think is pretty potent. All right, the number 1 card from Phyrexia All Will Be One, tested by a little over 50% of our respondents with an average rating of 2.4, is Cankerbloom. 1 and a green for a creature Phyrexian fungus. Pay 1, sacrifice Cankerbloom, choose 1, destroy target artifact, destroy target enchantment, or proliferate, and it is a 3/2. Anthony, everyone agreed with you. They were swayed by your compelling monologue about the virtues of Cankerbloom.
Everyone agrees. It's just a fun guy.
Yeah, I mean,
super fun guy.
This is I know every set there is that blog that does the official rundown of every card that is now officially been power crept in a like somewhat objective way, like the new list of objectively worse cards. And I really wonder how many cards this has displaced, as you used to be good and now you're just objectively worse than this. I saw someone comparing this to, was it Verdian Zealot? The green 2/1 that has pay a green and sacrifice it to destroy an artifact and enchantment.
Sounds right.
This makes that just, it's laughable how much better this card is than that card. And I remember seeing that card in cubes back in the day because artifacts and enchantments can be very important. And so it's not surprising that this is up here so high. If you have a green beatdown deck, this just beats down. If you want to remove artifacts and enchantments, it does that. And if you have any reason to proliferate, it also does that. It does all the things.
I recall a couple weeks ago, Anthony, you mentioned that this looked like a menu style effect to you. And I spent some time thinking about it. And I actually think it's extremely resonant choice of modes here. Fungi, primarily like in nature, they eat dead things and then they spread with spores. And Cankerbloom eats dead magical things, artifacts and enchantments, and spreads by proliferating its spores. So I think it's actually a really not just powerful and clean design, but also extremely resonant. So I'm like really excited about this card.
I think an artifact covered in fungi is very natural, not hard to imagine at all.
I'm just thinking about.
It's a bit of a leap to be like, oh, this enchantment got infested with fungi, but I'm going to give it to you, Parker. I'm going to give it to you. I see the flavor here, and I think once you've heard that story, you're gonna have that connection, whether you agree with it or not.
I just want to see a Cankerbloom altar that's that Tesla that got covered in fungus.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not supposed to say about Cankerbloom. I'm excited that of our top 5 cards, 4 of them are Cankerbloom, Sheoldred's Edict, Planar Disruption, and Ossification, because these are just, like I said, really clean bread and butter cards that maybe fill a little bit of a nook in the pantheon of Magic design that we didn't have fill before, which is exactly the kind of cards that Cube designers are excited about because it's just new ammunition for them in designing their environments.
Yeah, it's kind of funny looking at this set. At first glance, it sort of looked like, well, this is the poison set, and maybe there's not going to be a lot for Cube here. And
turns out it's
looking at it, this is the power crept removal set.
Yeah, it turns out this is iconic old spells updated to get rid of planeswalkers and being just a tiny bit better, which, great. Give us more of those. This is 1997 removal spells master set, pretty much.
While we're talking about power creep, I'm really sad at one particular power crept card. I started playing around Scars of Mirrodin, and so some of my first cards, I bought a repack from a store, and it had 300 copies of Sky Eel School in it. I don't know about 300, but it was a lot of Sky Eel Schools. It's a 3 blue 3/3 flying ETB loot one, and it was printed in Scars of Mirrodin. It was like a really good common there. And in this set, they print Quicksilver Fisher, which has a full point of power more than Sky Eel School and is otherwise identical. And I'm just so mad about that.
How dare they power creep Sky Eel School?
How dare they? So yeah, this is my platform to complain about that. But otherwise, I really like the set.
Time to post cringe on Blogatog about Sky Eel School. I believe in you, Parker. We would be remiss not to mention the results from the Phyrexia All-Be-One Commander survey as well. You know, sometimes we talk about it, sometimes we don't, depending on the results of the survey, but we have a fair number of responses on the Commander product here, and I think 3 cards that clearly jump out above the rest in terms of people's interest in them. The third most popular card is Otharri Sun's Glory. This is 3 red-white for a legendary creature Phoenix. It is a 3/3 with flying, lifelink, and haste. And whenever Otharri Sun's Glory attacks, you get an experience counter. Then create a 2/2 red rebel creature token that's tapped and attacking for each experience counter you have. And you can pay 2 red-white and tap an untapped rebel you control to return Otharri from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So, it's a 5-mana Rabblemaster-esque card that attacks and makes tokens that are tapped and attacking that also can bring itself back with its own tokens, but those tokens have to be untapped, so they have to have gotten into combat, which they enter the battlefield in combat, and survive that combat in order to bring back. I think it's a really compelling and cool card that's pretty flavorful. This Phoenix that brings its own army, that then the army can bring the Phoenix back.
Yeah, that's pretty intense. Everything about this card is like vivid. I mean, the abilities, the art, the mandatory foiling on this card. It's all just like, here I am, I'm powerful, I'm the sun's glory, and here's what I'm doing.
What's up, guys? This is Martin, aka Merkle Tony. My hot take for one is that Staff of the Storyteller will be the most slept on card from either the main release or the Commander release. It's a 2-drop artifact that gives you a 1/1 flyer, and then gives you an option to draw a card almost immediately, and then repeatedly lets you draw cards with token synergies in the best color to utilize tokens. So I think this card will long-term see a lot of play in low-to-the-ground token decks and go-wide strategies.
The number 2 card was Staff of the Storyteller. This is 1 and a white for an artifact. It has when Staff of the Storyteller enters the battlefield, create a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying. So at its base rate, it's kind of just a 2-mana 1/1 flyer. And then whenever you create 1 or more creature tokens, put a story counter on the staff. Pay white, remove a story counter from Staff of the Storyteller, and draw a card. So this is, it's been cool seeing so many white artifacts. I think they've really been pushing this theme, as well as obviously sort of trying to figure out this situation of how do we give white a card draw in a way that feels appropriate to the color pie, but still functions and, makes the color feel more reasonable in multiplayer formats. And I think this card is just a
more
powerful
reasonable in
execution
an
of that.
eternal world, Anthony.
In an eternal world, exactly. Because it gets a counter immediately from the token that it makes, and then you can just start slowly generating card advantage with it.
I did not look twice at this card when it was spoiled. I was like, that's kind of a cool card if you're really pushing a tokens theme and you want to like signal that with the text on the card. But then we got a hot take just comparing it to Thraben Inspector, which, yes, it's 2 mana upfront instead of 1, which is a big downside, but overall, you're paying still 3 mana to get a creature, draw a card, and then this one has the ongoing upside of potentially drawing you more cards if you make more creature tokens, which, in that light, kind of interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I actually misread this. I thought you had to remove multiple story counters, but it's just 1. So you could kind of just read this as a 3-mana 1/1 flyer that draws a card.
Yes.
With the upside of leaving behind this artifact that's going to keep drawing you cards if you have any other tokens.
And spreading that mana out over turns is relevant because...
Absolutely.
Yeah. What's the blue flyer 2/1 that
I'm
just
trying
draws?
to
Cloud
remember.
Conceer.
Cloud Conceer. There
like,
we go.
this is, is this as good as Cloud Conceer?
Well, Cloud Conceer is a 2/1.
It's a 2/1, but this you can also play on turn 2. You can't play Cloud Conceer on turn 2. You can use this to find your third land. You can't use Cloud Conceer to find your third land.
And there are just so many effects that make tokens now. I feel like I feel like you don't have to build around it at all, and that'll just draw you a bunch of cards.
But it'll also feel open-ended and let you feel clever. Like, every time you discover a new token that you didn't think about when you were building your deck or drafting, that'll be a fun moment of discovery with this.
Yeah, it is just creature tokens, so it's not going to trigger on all your treasures and clues and stuff, but still, I think it's still quite potent.
My problem with it is that it's a staff, but not an equipment, and that's weird to me, but yeah.
Yep, all right, we're off it.
Staff of the Storyteller. Are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin. Once upon a time there was a Thraben Inspector. She was a popular inclusion in many cubes, as a small creature drawing a card for 3 mana, paid in installments. Staff of the Storyteller provides similar advantages for a similar cost, trading a point of toughness for flying. Though paying 2 mana up front is a significant downside, a deck that can repeatedly create creature tokens pays only a single mana for each further card draw. I plan to test the staff as explicit support for token decks, not just as a generic payoff for going wide or having creatures to sacrifice, but as a card that specifically rewards a player for creating tokens. I expect it to be at its best in grindier decks with recursive token creators, as it does not add multiple counters for a burst of tokens created at once, and card draw is limited by needing to tap. Aesthetically, the staff is disappointing. I don't understand why Vraan, a very green creature, has a white staff when token production and creature-based card draw both exist in his part of the colour pie. Moreover, Vraan himself looks a little goofy as he hands me his sparkly staff. But I will gladly take that staff and say thank you, Vraan. Thank you for the staff, thank you for the stories, and may we all live happily ever after, except for those completed by Phyrexia who are doomed to an eternity of torment in a cruel mockery of life. Good night.
Okay, and if we're off it, then we might as well move on to our number 1 card from Phyrexia All Will Be One Commander. That is Glimmer Lens, 1 and a white for an artifact equipment. Here we go, an equipment. It has Formyridin!
Formyridin!
Meaning that it creates a rebel that is attached to the equipment, and whenever equipped creature and at least one other creature attack, draw a card. It's got equip, 1 and a white. It's tested by over half of our respondents for the Commander survey, which I should mention at this juncture, this was a record-breaking level of engagement for us. We had 80 responses, slightly more than 80. And
record-breaking for a Commander product.
For a Commander product, yeah. Which is like, I'm still impressed because a lot of people were paying attention to this supplemental set. That doesn't always happen. And a lot of people are testing this Glimmer Lens. It's got a rank of 2.1 on average. And, you know, the appeal is obvious. It's got the new mechanic. We know how Living Weapon works. And Formyridin exclamation point looks to be more favorable. It certainly reads better because the creature is real by itself instead of being a 0/0. And it draws cards for a cheap price. Those are all very appealing things.
Are you happy, Eternal Magic players?
Do these cards bum you out? Do you think this is like a sign of the decline of the color pie to see cards like this?
No, I do think I've come around to the fact that, you know, there's just so much card draw in Magic now that it's not just like, oh, it's a fun thing that blue can do and other colors can do. Sometimes it really does feel like just Magic is about drawing lots of cards, and having one color that just doesn't have access to it doesn't make as much sense today for contemporary Magic. So I do think overall it does make sense, and yeah, I mean, as a Cube player, if I'm not interested in these cards, I just don't play them. So
we see a lot of Cube players doing. I mean, 80 responses is still, you know, a third or less of what we got on the regular Phyrexia All Will Be One survey. So.
But this card is extremely powerful. I mean, at its base, it's just a bear that's going to draw a card pretty easily, and then drops a powerful equipment that can potentially draw you a bunch more cards down the line.
Yeah, I'm still into it. I think it's really cool. I have one complaint about this card, which is that I didn't even realize this, but the only way you can get the version that has the reminder text and the full card frame as opposed to the extended art is actually in, I think, one of the Commander decks, because the Collector's Boosters, which have the Commander cards in them sometimes, only have this as an extended art, which means that's the only one that my local game store could get. And I don't like the extended art because it doesn't have the Formyridin reminder text. And I don't think the Formyridin ability is going to be particularly memorable.
It's a pretty descriptive ability.
I don't think it's going to be particularly memorable in
you know,
2 years down the road or whatever when we're drafting my cube and people were like, why does this equipment say Formyridin on it? And why is it so bad? It's like, well, it turns out it's actually also just a 2/2.
Yeah, fair.
I think it's also notable that there are only like 13 Formyridin cards printed as opposed to like 20 toxic cards or more. So there's just not many of these to choose from. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to abilities like that, repetition is what creates the familiarity.
I think his cards are cool, though. Sometimes there is a quality to cards from Commander product that is hard to describe, that I can kind of pick them out of a lineup. I think it's some combination of the mechanics, and I gotta say, sometimes it feels like maybe their art budget is a little lower for the Commander product, and the illustrators are not spending as much time on the pieces, but these look great. I think they're clean in terms of their rules text. They're perfectly elegant enough. I could see any of them in the main set if they wanted to put them in there. So, yeah, whatever quality it is that sometimes irks me about Commander cards, these cards don't have it. These three, I think, are pretty elegant.
For me, the irksome quality is always the set symbol, how it's like always
worse.
A shield.
How is it always actually worse? Like, why is it never better somehow? I don't understand. But you're right, it is always worse. Did we do it, boys?
I think we might have done it.
I
think we clocked in at 90 minutes this time.
Yeah, a little bit under probably once we edit, but then I'm also going to have to add in all of the hot takes. We'll probably come in right around 90 minutes, so pretty good discussion. Thank you to everybody who spent your time responding to our survey, and I hope you get some benefit from it. If you haven't checked out the tool that allows you to pull your historical answers from surveys, you should check it out. It's really cool. It delivers it to you in a nicely formatted way. It makes tiny little histograms about your your responses over time, which is pretty compelling and exciting. So check that out and respond to future surveys. So if you're listening to this and you haven't responded in the past, in a year, it could be you looking back at those histograms and thinking, wow, I've grown so much as a Cube designer and Magic player.
And we obviously just talked about the top cards that the most people were interested in trying, but there's, a lot of other cards in the set, so we would definitely encourage you to go check out those articles, see the full list of all the cards and where they fall in terms of both people, how many people are interested in them, and how they evaluate them. And you can also just download the full raw data set with everybody's full comments and stuff like that, so if you're interested in seeing the complete picture, you can
Make your own data viz. Make something cool with it.
Thank you, everybody who submitted, and come back next time for even more data.
And it was great to meet those of you that we got to meet at MagicCon Philly. That was super fun. We will definitely be at CubeCon this year, which is happening. They finally put more details on the website. Before it was just a random countdown, but I think as of last week, they added some more details to it. So it is definitely coming back. They also put some of the information from last year's CubeCon back up, which I'm very grateful for. So we'll definitely be there. I don't think we're going to be at any events in between, but if we decide otherwise, we'll holler at you on the pod. That's it for this episode of Like Paper Radio. All the music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This show is produced by Anthony Parker and I, thinking really hard about magic cards, making a bunch of graphs and histograms and articles about them, and then speaking into microphones about it. Parker, Anthony, thank you for giving me part of your Saturday evening.
Absolutely my pleasure.
You're welcome.
It's like that thing my grandfather always says when you see him over the holidays or whatever, and then you leave, you say, bye, Granddad. He goes, it's good of you to see me. So it's basically